Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll be talking about Alysia, the Ice Weaver, and so please sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Alysia is a ranged DPS champion who excels in dealing damage, chilling, and freezing enemies from afar with her icy attacks. If you like constantly slowing enemies, freezing them occasionally, and dealing good burst damage from afar like a true ice mage, then Alysia is the champion for you, I think. While I think that she isn't exactly a beginner-friendly champion because of her lack of proper survivability and she has an unforgiving playstyle, I think that she's still a ton of fun to play because she can still dish out a ton of damage and CC when you have decent positioning, aiming, and teamwork with her teammates. Her strength as a champion lies in kiting, CCing enemies, and dealing damage from afar, so you will have to use those strengths to help you to victory and avoid those weaknesses of hers. So yeah, that was just a brief summary of Alysia as a champion. Now I will just quickly give a rundown on how this video is structured before I get into the meat of the guide. As with my older champion guides, I have split this guide up into 5 sections, and that is abilities, playstyle, battlerites, loadouts, and team comps. I have included timestamps directly to each section in the description below, so feel free to jump directly to a certain section that you need if you wish. I'd like to point out that I do not have a gameplay tips section anymore in my champion guides, since I feel like some of the tips are quite repetitive from champion to champion, and so these little gameplay tips will instead pop up in the video when they are relevant, I suppose. And so yeah, with all that being said, let's begin. First off, abilities. Alysia's left click or mouse one ability is Frostbolt, and this is her basic ranged projectile ability. What it does is Alysia will launch an ice bolt that will deal 15 damage to the target that it hits, and if the target is affected by the Chyill debuff, then the attack will deal 17 damage instead of 15, and so you want to try to make sure you hit all of your attacks when your enemies are chilled, since it also increases the duration of your chill effect. We'll get more into the Chyill debuff very shortly. Ice Lance is Alysia's mouse 2 ability, and this is one of Alysia's biggest single target burst damage outside of her ultimate ability. What it does is Alysia will fire this big ice bolt that deals 22 damage and inflicts a 2 seconds chill debuff to the target that it hits. If the target is already chilled, then it will deal 6 extra damage as well. The chill debuff typically slows enemies by up to 20%, and this slow percentage actually scales up depending on the remaining duration of the chill effect. The maximum duration of the chill debuff is 4 seconds, and because hitting the same target multiple times with your mouse 1 attacks increases that duration, so definitely try to hit your attacks on chilled targets where possible. To give you guys an example, if a person is chilled for 2 seconds, then the slow will be 10%, and if they're chilled for 4 seconds, then the slow will be 20%. Moving on, Alysia's spacebar ability is Arctic Wind, and this is her main and only movement ability, and what it does is Alysia will soar gracefully to a targeted location. That's it. She does avoid all attacks while soaring though, so there's that, and it flies pretty far. Because this is your only movement ability, it is also your most important ability, since it is your main escape out of a bad position. Definitely try to avoid using this ability for offensive purposes, unless you know for sure that there will be backup or the enemy you are chasing is 1 to 2 hits away from dying. If the enemies catch you without this ability, you'll probably die within that 8 seconds that it takes for the ability to cool down, so yeah, use it wisely. Next up, Alysia's Q ability is Glacial Prism, and this is her shield ability. What it does is Alysia will shield a targeted ally, and that shield can absorb up to 24 damage. When it breaks, whether it be from damage or from the shield simply expiring after 1.4 seconds, it will explode and inflict a 2 seconds chill on nearby enemies, and so this ability can be quite useful against melee enemies who get close, or you can perhaps use it on melee teammates that are near to enemies so that you can apply chill to them when it breaks. Because of Alysia's lack of good survivability, I'd say you usually want to use this ability on yourself for its shielding, unless you know you'll be relatively safe for a while and can afford not having it, then I guess you could put it on the teammate to help them out a little bit. On to Alysia's E ability, Flash Freeze. What this ability does is Alysia will call down a frozen star at a targeted location, and when this star touches the ground after 0.9 seconds, enemies within that area of effect will be dealt 15 damage and be chilled for 3 seconds. If the enemy is already chilled to begin with, then the enemy is inflicted with the freeze debuff instead, which pretty much works like a 3 seconds petrify effect. In addition to the petrify effect, where the target gains a 20 health shield but is unable to do anything, the frozen enemy is also immune to chill. So yeah, this ability is your main way of freezing enemies, so you will want to get used to hitting these onto enemies who have used their escape cooldowns already, so that you can put them out of the fight for a couple of seconds at least. I'll give you guys a little bit more on this ability later when we get to the other sections of the guide. So those were Alysia's abilities which doesn't require energy. Now let us move on to those which do. Alysia's R ability is Ice Crown, and what this ability does for 25 energy is Alysia will launch this barrier thing forward, which can knock enemies back at the same time as it's moving up. This barrier has 20 health, and so it can help soak or block enemy attacks that are directed at it, and when it breaks, a cone of icicles shoots forward from it to deal 20 damage and inflict a 2 seconds chill to enemies that are hit by it. Because this ability doesn't really do any damage unless the enemy breaks it, you typically want to use this ability to counter incoming enemy projectiles that deals at least 20 damage to make the most out of this ability. Otherwise, if you're up against melee champions who are trying to get close, using it just for the knockback is also a good option. Moving on, Alysia's first EX ability is a Shift Q ability, Ice Block. What this ability does for 25 energy is Alysia will encase a targeted ally within ice to heal them for 30 health over 3.5 seconds. In addition to the heal during this 3.5 seconds, the ally cannot move or use any abilities, but they are immune to disables and up to 40 damage can be blocked by the ability. This ability can be extremely useful when you need some healing, but you don't have a support teammate nearby to heal you up, or when you need to avoid a hard-hitting ability and stuff. Since the ability can be targeted on allies as well, you can use it to heal them up as well, or you can use it to help them to avoid some punishing attacks as well. Just be careful not to accidentally screw them over instead, since it does stop them from moving and using their abilities. If you wish to cancel this ability prematurely so that you can move again, you can press C just like any other abilities. Next up, Alysia's second EX ability is a Shift E ability, Snow Cone. What this ability does is Alysia will channel a short-range cone of snow in front of her, which deals 24 damage and inflict the 4-second chill debuff over its 1.5 seconds channel duration. If the enemy is fully chilled during the channeling of this ability, as in their chilled duration reaches 4 seconds, then the enemy will be frozen in place. Pretty neat little ability. However, the major downside to this ability is its really short range, and so its use will most likely be limited to situations where you're kind of near to a melee enemy and you need to freeze them in place to stop them from attacking you. Since it is an AoE attack, it can go through counters, and so it can be used when enemies use their counters as well, and that can be quite useful sometimes, I suppose. Outside of those situations, it might be quite hard to find situations to use it, and so I think this ability will be largely ignored or unused, since the normal E ability is just a little bit more consistent without even the use of energy. A little bit unfortunate, but there are bound to be abilities on certain champions that are only useful in niche situations. Finally, Alysia's ultimate ability on the F key is Frozen Gallery, and this is Alysia's super large AoE attack. What it does is Alysia will mark a huge path of frost in front of her, and after a 0.9 second delay, all enemies caught within the area will be dealt 35 damage and are frozen immediately. 35 damage is some pretty decent burst damage, but its main use is probably to set up for other damaging combos by quickly and efficiently locking down multiple enemies. The ability doesn't have a targeting reticle, but because the area of effect is so big, you can usually target it in the general direction of your enemy, and it will usually hit them if they don't have an escape ready to jump out of it, or if they can't react fast enough to walk out of the area. And so yeah, that's about it for Alysia's abilities. Let us move on and talk a little bit about her playstyle. Alysia's playstyle is rather straightforward, but the difficult part is using her abilities at the right time while utilizing them to its fullest. This is especially true for her spacebar, mouse 2, E and mouse 1 abilities. What you typically want to be doing as Alysia is to stay behind your team and just poke at enemies from afar with your mouse 1 and mouse 2 abilities. If you manage to hit an enemy with your mouse 2 attack and the enemy was forced to use their escapes at some point, then you can follow it up with your E ability for a nice freeze to put them out of the fight for a while. At that point, you can either focus that guy down with your teammate or change targets and hit the unfrozen target. If the fight is an all-out poke battle where enemies aren't forced to use their escapes, then you can feel free to use your E ability to poke as well and try to follow up with your mouse 2 for some damage, I suppose. Perhaps you can force some of them to use their escapes this way. Remember that your mouse 1 attacks do bonus damage and chill to enemies already affected by chill, so by all means, focus down those targets with your attacks if there's no other better enemy to target at that point. Onto your defensive abilities like Q, spacebar and R. I don't usually talk about Battlerites until we get to the Battlerites section, but for Alysia's Q ability, I will make an exception. There is a Battlerites that you can get for a Q ability called Figure Skating, and what this Battlerites does to your Q ability is that it lets your Q ability apply a 60% fading haste buff in addition to what it does normally. I take this Battlerites like more than 90% of the time, mostly because I love the utility you get from the movement speed boost. For an immobile champion like Alysia, this movement speed boost is invaluable for your survival since you can run away from attacks and stuff, and it is also extremely useful when you're trying to be aggressive. If your team has a melee champion, then this movement speed boost could be useful for them as well, since it can help them close the gap on your enemies much easier. Because I take this Battlerites almost all of the time, I mostly use this Q ability as more of a speed boost, and the shielding plus Chyill explosion is just a bonus effect. And so yeah, usage of your defensive abilities will probably depend on whether you are fighting with melee or ranged champions. Against melee champions, and if melee enemies manage to come close to me, I typically knock them back with an R first, and only use my Q for its shield and speed boost to kite them a little bit more if they manage to catch up to me again. If they somehow manage to gap close once more even after all of that, then I will resort to using my spacebar towards a safe spot where my teammate can potentially help me out. When against ranged champions, your R will mostly be used to counter their hard-hitting abilities like Jade Snipe, Jumong's Mouse 2 and so on, and your Q will mostly be used to help you poke a little easier with a movement speed boost or to avoid enemy attacks. Again, spacebar will be safe for times when it is absolutely necessary since it is your lifeline. Using EXQ is quite simple and it mostly depends on how you like to use it. Personally, I use it mostly as a heal during downtimes, but if I find a perfect opportunity to use it to avoid hard-hitting abilities or save allies from danger, then I'll use it for those times. Assuming you're hitting most of your abilities, energy isn't usually a problem for Alysia, since your main playstyle revolves around your abilities that doesn't require energy. Because Alysia's EXE's usefulness is quite niche, I pretty much covered it all in the earlier abilities section already, so I'll avoid repeating it here. You realize that since you don't need to use your EXE as often, you typically have enough energy to use your ultimate ability a couple of times in a round. Like with most hard-hitting ultimate abilities, you probably want to bait out enemy escapes first before you use it, so definitely try to use your mouse 2 followed by E onto enemies to get them to use their escapes before using your ultimate ability onto them. The range on your ultimate ability is super long, so definitely use that to your advantage. It's extremely powerful if you can hit 2 to 3 enemies with it, but sometimes, even if you can only hit a single enemy with it, it can be worth it, especially if you know that it will hit the enemy since it is still 35 damage and a 3 seconds freeze. So yeah, that's mostly it on Alysia's playstyle. Now let us move on to Alysia's Battlerites options and loadouts. Because there are so many Battlerites currently and it will take me a long while to go through and describe all of them one by one, I will just display them here, and if you wish you can go ahead and pause the video to slowly read through them before continuing with the video. And so pause now to read through the first half. And now again for the second half. Okay, now that I've read through all of them, let's continue. First off, I think that Alysia has 3 Battlerites that are often too good to pass up, and these are Blizzard, Snowstorm, and Figure Skating. I've already talked about Figure Skating earlier, about why I really like to take it almost all the time and all that, so I'll just talk a little bit about when you may not want to pick it up. In matches where both teams are all ranged champions, so you're not up against any melee enemies and your team doesn't have a melee champion who can make good use of the movement speed boost plus explosion of Chyill, then I think Figure Skating isn't as required and you can pick something else in its place. Personally, I just really like the utility of having that movement speed boost, so I take it sometimes even in those all ranged matchups. As you may know, Alysia's E ability is a main way of freezing targets, but the area of effect of a base E ability is rather small, and so it can sometimes be quite hard to actually hit people with the E ability. For this reason, taking Blizzard is almost always mandatory for Alysia to more consistently hit enemies with her E, and the cooldown reduction is also a pretty good bonus since that means she can use it to freeze people and do damage with it more often. Because you typically be freezing enemies with your E ability, you will also want to take the Snowstorm Battlerites for some nice guaranteed damage on the enemy while they are frozen in place, since the Snowstorm damage pierces the shield of the freeze effect. Not to mention, the lingering damage over time effect also makes Alysia's E ability a very good zoning tool. So yeah, I think those 2 E Battlerites should be picked all the time in Alysia's current iteration because they just make your E ability super strong, and Figure Skating should be picked up most of the time as well for its crazy utility. For the remaining Battlerites slots, you can fill them up with Battlerites depending on what you need in the matchup that you're facing. If you need a bit more survival, Battlerites like Frost Nova, Twirl, and Crystalline Lattice are some pretty good options. Against sticky melee champions, Frost Nova is a really good pickup because of a neat little combo you can do. If an enemy melee is onto you, put your E down on top of yourself and spacebar away to inflict the Chyill debuff on the enemy just before the E lands so that you can freeze them with the E hit. Even if you're not doing that, it's also just generally useful to slow the melee enemy down as you jump so that they will find it a little bit harder to catch back up to you after that. Chyill is just a generally good survival Battlerites since it gives you a second iframe after your initial big jump when you use your spacebar ability, which could let you avoid a second attack or maybe jump over a nearby wall. So I'd say if you're simply looking for a survival Battlerites that is good in most situations, then Chyill is the one to go for. About Crystalline Lattice, I think that it's mostly useful against multiple melee enemies since it is in those matchups where you're more likely to expend that 24 or 36 damage shield amount within that 1.4 seconds of shield uptime. Furthermore, that 20% range increase in that explosion isn't enough for it to be reliable against ranged enemies, but it will definitely make it more reliable at hitting melee enemies. If you need a bit more damage potential, then Battlerites such as Icebreaker, Cryogenic Lance, Vandalism, and Piercing Cold can be some pretty good picks I think. Icebreaker makes it so that your mouse 2 damage goes through the freeze and deal more damage. This means that if you can somehow freeze an opponent without using your mouse 2 first, then you have a guaranteed 25 damage just like that. Even though Cryogenic Lance is a control Battlerites, the reason I list it as a Battlerites that could increase your damage potential is because with this Battlerites, you're more likely to chill targets even if you don't hit your target directly with your mouse 2 ability. Your mouse 1s deal more damage on chilled targets, and so it kind of gives you a bit more damage in a way. Vandalism is an alright Battlerites for damage since you can use your R and follow it up with your mouse 1 for some damage and chill on the target. The thing is, this Battlerites isn't that valuable if you can consistently get the enemy to break the R for you, so the better you are with Alysia, the less value you actually get out of this Battlerites. But for starters, it is a pretty good Battlerites for more damage if you fancy breaking your R with your mouse 1s manually. Also, since there's not a lot of flexible Battlerites slots for Alysia, there are usually better Battlerites than Vandalism to get if you're looking for more damage. If you're going up against multiple long-range champions like Taya, Jumong and so on, or maybe champions like Pestilus or Blossom who can put down other units, Piercing Cold could be pretty useful because of its extra range and piercing effect. You will be able to hit them from further away with this Battlerites and perhaps even outpoke them in a poke fight. Finally, I think the remaining Battlerites, that is, Frozen Muse, Wintry Blast, Arctic Cloak, Permafrost, Agility and Inspiration, aren't really that useful most of the time for the current iteration of Alysia. It's quite a long list of less viable Battlerites, mostly because of the low number of flexible Battlerites slots, and it's not really because the Battlerites themselves are really bad or something. They still do have a place and time for them, but other Battlerites just outshine them depending on what you need, whether it may be survival or damage. Alysia is already quite unforgiving to play, and so you typically want to play with Battlerites that are always going to be helpful to you in a match. In any case, I'll still give a couple of reasons why this Battlerites may not be as good currently. Frozen Muse sounds really good in theory, but the reason why it isn't as good as it sounds is because after freezing an enemy, you only have 3 seconds to make use of these enhanced mouse 1 attacks. If you intend to freeze an enemy and go for the other teammate, you may be out of position to target the other teammate immediately, and so you at most get to make use maybe about 1 to 2 seconds of the buff from the Battlerites. If you want to go for the frozen enemy, then you'll be wasting a few shots of your enhanced mouse 1 just to break the freeze to begin with. Unless your teammate helps you to break out the freeze, then you're unlikely to get much value out of the Battlerites. I suppose it could be useful if you always intend to focus down the frozen target with a teammate, but outside of that it might be hard to find use for Frozen Muse. On to Wintry Blast, the reason why it's not that great is because it is quite often too hard to make use of the damage. You typically don't want to stay near to melee enemies for too long, and so it's hard to justify taking this Battlerites to make use of that 10 damage explosion. Even if you have Crystalline Lattice buffing your explosion range, it is still not too worth it I think, and there are better offensive Battlerites out there. I suppose it could be useful if you are predominantly using a Q on melee teammates, but then again it is still rather inconsistent since your teammate may not be able to stick onto enemies all the time for it to work. Arctic Cloak is almost always bad because the shield isn't a huge deal most of the time, and is mostly only useful when you're up against multiple melee enemies since that's when you'll be casting E on top of yourself. Even then though, there are better Battlerites like Crystalline Lattice or Frost Nova to take in those situations. As with most Battlerites that augment ultimate abilities, Permafrost isn't that great because you hardly get use out of it since ultimates are only used maybe 2 to 3 times in a round. The extra freeze duration might be cool, but usually 3 seconds is long enough anyways. The chill effect that is applied onto enemies will typically be removed if enemies get frozen, so the Battlerites kind of shoots itself in the foot here. The only way the chill effect stays is if enemies were in the area to begin with, but somehow manage to walk out or jump out before the freeze lands onto them. I guess it is kind of nice to apply those chill effects this way, but I think it's not really worth picking up this Battlerites just for these little chill effects that you sometimes get because other Battlerites just offer a lot more. On to agility, I think that the 10% movement speed is quite nice for some survival and additional kiting ability, But again, I think Alysia needs much more than just 10% movement speed to survive properly, so it loses out to other Battlerites like figure skating in terms of value. Inspiration is usually good for a lot of champions, but the reason why I think it is not as good with Alysia is because she hardly needs her energy at all outside of her R and ultimate ability. In games with support teammates, her EXQ isn't as needed and her EXE is only useful in niche situations. And so for this reason, Alysia is usually never starved of energy, except for times just after she uses her ultimate ability and at the start of the game. She just doesn't really need the extra maximum energy and energy gain, I guess, except maybe when she's against multiple sticky melee enemies without support in her team, then maybe it might be okay. But you probably have to sacrifice Frost Nova or figure skating or icebreaker for this, which you may not want to do. So yeah, those were my thoughts on most of the Battlerites for Alysia, but like I mentioned in my beginner tips video, I think you want to at least give a bit of thought about what Battlerites you're using before each round, since that is a good way of understanding the champion more, and it will help with making sure you learn what are the best situations to use which Battlerites and so on. But in case you just want to quickly take a loadout and jump straight into a game, here are some loadouts that I use. To start off, here's the standard build I take most of the time. Blizzard, Snowstorm and Figure Skating is in all of my builds for the reasons I mentioned earlier, and so here they are. They just offer so much value in every situation, and so I really love having them in all of my builds. In most games, if I play smartly and position myself properly, I can get away with taking both Cryogenic Lens and Icebreaker for some nice damage and CC output from afar. But if I feel I might be pressured because I'm up against really good players or annoying lineups, then I might go for a build like this where I swap out Icebreaker for Twirl. This gives me a second iframe, and so I'm punished less for misplaying with this build. If your team lacks damage, then I guess you could keep Icebreaker and you can take out Cryogenic Lens to fit Twirl in as well. Against multiple melee enemies, instead of Twirl, I'll take Frost Nova for that little combo I mentioned earlier, and the rest of the Battlerites can stay mostly the same. The reason for taking Icebreaker instead of Cryogenic Lens in this case is because you have a few good ways of freezing enemies without using your mouse tool with this build. Melee enemies who come close to you are susceptible to getting chilled by your Q, your spacebar and your EXE, and so you are more likely to have your mouse tool ready to hit on frozen targets. Just make sure to gain some distance from your frozen target first before you mouse to them and break that freeze. And so yeah, that's about it on Alysia's Battlerites and Loadouts. That was a fairly lengthy part, but we'll now move on to champions that synergize with Alysia before we finish the guide off with some final notes on Alysia. On team compositions, I find that Alysia can synergize with most champions quite well, but more so with melee or support teammates I feel. She actually does pretty well with ranged teammates too, since she has some semi-supportive abilities with the Q and EXQ, and lots of slowing capabilities that would help out ranged allies hit their ranged attacks. But even so, I think she shines more with a melee or support teammate as compared to ranged teammates. When teamed with support teammates, Alysia is more forgiving to play since she can be healed up a little bit more by supports, and in return, those chill and freeze effects that Alysia can put out are also really helpful for peeling for support teammates, and so that's why I think they go really well together. When teamed with melee teammates, her chill and freeze effects really help her melee teammates close the gap and deal damage, so that's super useful. Her Q ability with the movement speed buff is also extremely handy for helping melee teammates chase their targets, and in return, the melee teammates can help draw attention away from Alysia and help her peel while she attacks her enemies from afar. A special mention goes to Croak, because I think Alysia pairs with Croak really well, since they can set up for each other's burst damage combos. Croak's stun or incaps makes it a lot easier to freeze enemies, and frozen enemies are sitting ducks for Croak's stuns or incaps. Alysia's movement speed boost with a Q makes it very easy for Croak to land his incaps or stuns, or even without it, just the chill effect is usually enough as well. So yeah, Croak plus Alysia for 2s seems like a pretty fun combo, and for 3 vs 3s, I guess Croak, Alysia and Poloma together could work, since Poloma can provide Alysia with some extra iframes with her mouse tool and EX space as well to make Alysia more survivable. These are of course not the best comps for Alysia, and they are also not the only viable ones. I just shared these comps because I think they are quite fun to play and they are pretty effective. So yeah, I think Alysia is a really fun champion to play if you're into kiting, CCing and doing damage from afar. But like I've mentioned multiple times in this video already, she is quite unforgiving to play, and so some practice will be required before you get good with her. You need some good positioning habits, and in some matchups you also have to play really smart and be a bit creative to survive and deal damage effectively. And so yeah, that's about it for my Alysia guide. I hope you guys found it useful. From the votes on my Destiny guide some time ago, Jade was voted to be the next updated guide after Alysia's guide, so you can expect an updated Jade guide coming soon. I know that the next new champion, which is probably Lucy's big brother, will be either out soon or out already by the time this video goes live, and so the next guide after Jade would be on him. If you'd like to vote for which champion guide I'll update next after Lucy's big brother, click on the I button at the top right now to participate in the poll. And so yeah, that's about it for this video, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as well. If you did, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave any questions or thoughts in the comment section below, share this video with your friends, and you can check out my other videos as well if you haven't already. I stream 3 days a week on Twitch nowadays as well, so do check me out on twitch.tv/Chyill if you're into watching people play Battlerites live. Thank you very much for watching my video, and until next time guys, have a great day, keep gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.